think about the speed of immigration, the type of immigration we do want, and that means the type of immigration that we just don't need more of. These are really ugly and difficult.
Flight 138 left New York's JFK airport around 8 o'clock, headed for London's Heathrow airport. It was diverted, though, to Boston's Logan airport.
A disaster just happened at Heathrow Airport in the United Kingdom, and it has shocked British political commentator Douglas Murray and the entire world.
It's crashing down on me. Listen to it. It's over the top of me now. Oh! 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 Stop it!
A recent crash at the airport almost caused passengers and members of the plane's crews to lose their lives. This isn't the first time Heathrow Airport has drawn the world's attention with its catastrophic airplane crashes. As if to make matters worse,
London-bound 777 was thundering down the runway yesterday afternoon when, at the first sign of trouble, the pilot slammed on the brakes, bringing the jet to a safe stop.
In recent months, the airport has recorded new highs of immigration invasion that Douglas Murray is upset with. How did the recent crash at the airport happen? Why do so many plane crashes happen at this same airport? And what is the current immigration invasion issue Douglas Murray has complained about regarding the airport? Join us as we go behind the scenes of Heathrow Airport and how Douglas Murray just exposed them. The recent plane crash at Heathrow Airport.
We do know at this time the plane had a pilot and 2 passengers, and as you just mentioned, all 3 people died.
Just a few weeks ago, a terrifying incident happened at Heathrow Airport. With passengers on board, 2 planes crashed into each other in a very unexpected collision, resulting in obvious damage to both aircraft. Fortunately, no injuries were reported and all the passengers were safe. The incident involved a British Airways plane carrying 121 passengers to Accra in Ghana and a Virgin Atlantic aircraft. According to Virgin Atlantic, their Boeing 787-9, which was completely empty at the time, was being towed from the stand at Terminal 3 when the tragedy happened. The plane had just landed and was on its way to a different part of the airfield.
A Virgin Atlantic plane was forced to make an emergency landing in Boston last night after a fire broke out in the cabin.
Virgin Atlantic has launched an investigation into the incident and quickly conducted maintenance checks on the affected aircraft, which has been taken out of service. The crash not only got people talking about the unplanned tragedies that often happen in Heathrow Airport, but it also drew the world's attention to the immigration invasion that has also been happening a lot at Heathrow Airport. And Douglas Murray is not pleased with this. Not only did he not hide his anger on this topic, but he has made some points we can't help but think about. In an interview with a Muslim woman that very quickly turned into a debate, Douglas Murray was very insistent on the fact that immigration isn't like it used to be anymore.
When the failures of Islam throughout the world, the failures of all Islamic societies come here into Britain. Their intolerance of freedom of conscience, their intolerance of apostates, their intolerance of freedom of expression and freedom of speech.
The unimaginable rise in immigration through Heathrow Airport and how immigrants seem to want to change UK laws to fit their religion and cultures upset him. If you think about it, it's no surprise Douglas Murray feels that way because in the last 2 years, a record number of over 100,000 people arrived in the UK illegally in small boats. Most of these people came from 5 countries: Afghanistan, Iran, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. In 2022 alone, over 45,000 came to the UK without permission by crossing the English Channel from France. The crash between the British Airways plane and the Virgin Atlantic aircraft isn't the first time such has happened in Heathrow. Disasters like this have been happening at this UK airport since the early 1940s. One in particular that the world still talks about is the Heathrow disaster that happened in 1948.
Heathrow and the tragic remains of the Belgian Dakota airliner which crashed during a landing in Park. 3 passengers miraculously escaped from the blazing wreck, but the other 16, with a crew of 3, lost their lives.
On March 2nd, a devastating aviation accident occurred when a Douglas DC-3C aircraft operated by Sabena, the Belgian airline, crashed. This incident was the first major accident at Heathrow Airport that made the news for weeks. The accident resulted in the loss of 20 lives out of the 22 people on board, with the majority of the victims being British nationals. Next was the 1950 Heathrow BEA Vickers Viking crash. On October 31st that year, a Vickers Viking aircraft, operated by British European Airways, popularly called BEA, noisily crashed into each other in thick fog. The Vickers Viking plane was on a scheduled flight from Paris to Northolt Airport in London, but unfortunately, 28 out of 30 people on board, including passengers and crew, lost their lives in the crash. That's not all. On October 1, 1956, a military Avro Vulcan B-1 crashed while attempting to land in horrible weather conditions. Although the captain and co-pilot managed to escape the plane safely,
it was on the landing at London Airport that the disaster occurred. The Vulcan had flown non-stop from Aden and, coming in very poor visibility, crashed and exploded on the runway.
The remaining 3 crew members and 1 passenger on board tragically lost their lives in the accident. For a few years, it seemed Heathrow Airport and tragic crashes wouldn't happen anymore until January 17, 2008. British Airways Flight 38, a Boeing 777-200ER aircraft, was on a scheduled international passenger flight from Beijing Capital International Airport to London Heathrow Airport, covering a distance of approximately 5,000 miles. As it was landing at Heathrow, already close to the runway, the plane crashed badly. Among the 152 people on board, 47 were injured, while 1 had a serious emergency condition. Fortunately, no one died.
Hey, I can't get power on the engines.
What do you mean?
It's not giving me power.
Besides the recent crash at Heathrow, Douglas Murray's second concern regarding the airport is an absolutely alarming immigrant invasion. The fact that many UK natives agree with Douglas has caused an increase in the number of Muslims being stopped and questioned by police at airports and ports. This is happening under a law meant to prevent terrorism, but human rights group Cage says it's being used too much and unfairly targets Muslims. Cage says this practice is discriminatory and has become a form of Islamophobia. Cage has found that many Muslim women are being asked to remove their headscarves when they are stopped, even though most of these stops don't lead to any charges.
Something fundamentally ludicrous about somebody dressed as you are talking the language of modern human rights.
Absolutely.
What's a bit fundamentally ludicrous?
In fact, out of 420,000 instances, only 0.007% resulted in a conviction. This shows that the practice is not in any way helping matters and is instead causing harm to innocent people. Cage is worried about the impact this is having on Muslim communities. Cage has taken action by filing a complaint with the police watchdog, the Independent Office for Police Conduct, on behalf of 10 people who have been affected. They have also written to MPs, who are part of a group focused on issues affecting British Muslims, to raise awareness about the issue. Adnan Siddiqui, the head of Cage,
Muslims in the Balkans, he was politically active. How can his name, someone who was such a publicly active citizen, be taken up in such a horrible way?
Wrote a letter expressing concern about a law that allows police to stop and question people without any reason to suspect them of wrongdoing. He said that tens of thousands of people are being subjected to this treatment, which he believes is a form of discrimination against Muslims. He described the experience as harassment and said it was causing harm to innocent people. One British citizen, Omar, shared his story of being stopped by police 40 times since 2005, even after he had never been convicted of any crime. He even helped someone in need on a flight, but was still questioned by police when he got off the plane. He feels like the law is stacked against him, and it's almost impossible to avoid being targeted. The law in question, Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act 2000, allows police to detain people at airports and borders for up to 6 hours if they suspect them of being involved in terrorism.
Muhammad found himself in a more difficult situation. They put him into a room and kept popping in and out, asking him questions.
Now, here's where things get more interesting: curbing Islamic immigration invasion. Douglas Murray has said that to reduce the frequency of airplane crashes and curb Islamic immigration invasion in the UK, especially of bloodthirsty Islamic terrorists, among other things, one of the things we should consider is the withdrawal of passports. While many are wondering how this can help with the many crashes, Douglas believes that not only has the Heathrow immigration invasion not got anything to do with race, but it has a lot to do with religion. For example, in 2015, a Muslim woman from the United States was detained for 13 hours at Heathrow Airport in the UK. Ayan Mohammed was traveling to visit her family in Leicester, but was held and questioned for hours after arriving at the airport. She believes she was targeted because of her faith and felt judged and discriminated against. Ayan said she was not prepared for the intense questioning and detention she experienced. She had never traveled outside of the US before and was not expecting such treatment. The UK Border Force claimed that the checks were for immigration purposes, but Ayan felt it was unfair and excessive. She was eventually released and allowed to continue her journey to Leicester. The incident was taken up by Keith Vaz, the MP for Leicester East, who is also the chairman of the Home Affairs Select Committee. He promised to raise Ayan's case and investigate the matter further. There's more. In a similar incident, a woman who had just returned from a religious trip to Mecca was stopped at an airport in 2019.
A Muslim woman from New Jersey claims she was unfairly removed from an American Airlines flight at Newark Airport after saying a passenger in first class harassed her.
Even though she was feeling unwell on the plane, she was still detained for 5 hours and separated from her family. She was asked to provide fingerprints and a DNA sample, and her luggage and phone were searched. During her detention, the woman was questioned about her thoughts on a terrorist attack in Westminster in 2017 and conflicts in Syria and Yemen. She replied that she did not condone the killing of innocent people. After being held for 5 hours, she was finally released, with the authorities telling her that she had complied with the laws. Many Muslims who have been stopped and questioned at airports report being asked about their religious beliefs and practices. They are often asked if they pray regularly, fast during Ramadan, and if they have visited Mecca. These questions can make them feel like they are being judged for practicing their faith. A filmmaker who had previously worked in Syria and was traveling to Amsterdam via Dover reported having a similar experience. He felt that the questioning was designed to make him feel guilty for practicing Islam. He said that the whole experience was humiliating and made him feel like he had done something wrong. It seems stopping Muslim immigrants in UK airports like Heathrow didn't just start in recent years. In 2003, a Muslim man from America was not allowed to board a flight to Jeddah from Heathrow Airport. Ahmed Saleh was traveling from Philadelphia and had already reached the gate for his connecting flight when he was stopped. He was confused and didn't know why he was being prevented from boarding. The immigration officer told Ahmed that his visa for Saudi Arabia was not valid, but Ahmed was sure that his visa was correct. He had already traveled halfway around the world and had not been stopped until now.
British Muslim family told they could not fly to the United States. Now, initially, the family of 11 said that they'd received authorization to fly in advance.
British Airways, like all airlines, is responsible for making sure that passengers have the right visas before they start their journey. The next day, Ahmed went to the Saudi embassy and they confirmed that his visa was indeed valid. But by then, he had already missed his flight and lost some of his luggage. He was finally able to fly to Jeddah 3 days later, but his baggage still hadn't arrived. Ahmed was frustrated and upset that he hadn't received any explanation or apology from UK immigration or British Airways. Muslim immigrants aren't the only ones experiencing issues at UK airports like Heathrow. In February 2009, Geert Wilders, a Dutch politician known for his controversial views on Islam, was denied entry to the UK. He had planned to show his film, Fitna, at the House of Lords, but the Home Office sent him a letter refusing his entry into the country. The letter stated that his views could disrupt community harmony and pose a threat to public safety. Wilders arrived at Heathrow Airport but was stopped by immigration officials. He was not allowed to enter the country, despite his plans to show his film. Wilders' film, Fitna, criticizes the Quran and has been deemed offensive by many. The UK government's decision to refuse him entry was seen as a move to prevent potential unrest and promote community cohesion. Geert Wilders, the leader of the Freedom Party, was on a plane from Amsterdam when he talked to Dutch journalists. He said he had visited Britain in December.
He proposed a ban on Islamic headscarves in public buildings, declared that his party would ban the Quran, close mosques and Islamic schools.
Without any issues, and didn't understand why he was being stopped this time. He wondered why he was allowed in before, but not now. Wilders was asked if he had a message for the UK government. He said they should let him in because of freedom of speech, even if they didn't like him or his views. He said that if they didn't let him in, they would look like cowards. Wilders' film, Fitna, shows images of the September 11th attacks, along with quotes from the Quran. When it was released last year, it sparked violent protest in the Muslim world. In 2007, Wilders called for the Quran to be banned and compared it to Adolf Hitler's book, Mein Kampf. Recently, a court in Amsterdam ruled that Wilders should be prosecuted for inciting racial hatred, but Wilders has appealed against this decision. The Home Office sent a letter to Geert Wilders, signed by Home Secretary Jackie Smith, stating that his presence in the UK would pose a serious threat to society. The letter said that Wilders' statements about Muslims and their beliefs, as expressed in his film and elsewhere, would disrupt community harmony and put public safety at risk. The Dutch government disagreed with the UK's decision and vowed to work towards lifting the travel ban on Wilders. Maxime Verhagen, the Dutch foreign minister, expressed his government's support for Wilders' right to travel to the UK. Even with the ban, the screening of Wilders' film was set to go ahead as planned at the House of Lords. Lord Pearson, A UK Independence Party peer who invited Wilders to Britain said that the event would proceed with or without Wilders' presence. Pearson defended his decision, citing the importance of free speech. Pearson mentioned that he disagreed with some of Wilders' views, but believed that the Dutch politician was a brave man who was not racist. Pearson's stance quickly started a debate about the balance between free speech and community harmony.
Mr. Wilders, as a politician, made himself guilty of insulting a group and inciting discrimination.
Heathrow Airport's response to the allegations. On one hand, Douglas Murray has the opinion that it is people who have participated in extremely bloodthirsty massacres that should not ever return to the UK, and if they do come back, the UK has to work out a policy of what to do with them. On the other hand, British airports are straight up depriving any Muslim who is unlucky that random day from entering the region. Heathrow Airport says it is committed to treating all passengers equally, regardless of their religion or race. But a report released in the early days of July this year by a watchdog group has said otherwise. The watchdog has raised serious concerns about the conditions at an immigration detention centre close to Heathrow Airport. The report found that the centre was severely overcrowded, with terrible drug use and violence, putting the detainees at risk of harm. The watchdog group's report described the detention centre as chaotic and dangerous, with absolutely shocking conditions. The facility was also described to be in urgent need of repair. Charlie Taylor, the lead investigator, was so alarmed by the findings that he contacted James Cleverly, a government official, in March, but neither Cleverly nor his department responded to the report's findings. The Home Office has since increased staffing levels at the detention centre, but the report's findings are still a cause for concern. The government needs to take immediate action to address the issues at the detention centre and ensure the safety and well-being of the detainees. James Cleverly has been asked to comment on the report's findings, and the public is waiting for a response. Mitty Care and Custody, the company in charge of Harmondsworth, explained that the centre's capacity had been reduced due to ongoing renovations. An immigration removal centre is a place where people are held while they wait for decisions on their immigration status, deportation, or removal from the country.
Plans for new immigration detention centres, like at the RAF base in the constituency of Foreign Secretary James Cleverly, a plan he opposes.
Mr. Cleverly.
The chief inspector wrote to James Cleverly after a report revealed that conditions at the centre had badly deteriorated since the last inspection. The report stressed some concerns, including an obvious increase in assaults, many suicide attempts, and overcrowding. To accommodate more detainees, cells were being used beyond their capacity, and those who refused to share cells were placed in isolation until they agreed. Staff at Harmondsworth Immigration Removal Centre were mostly hiding in their offices, which had "Do Not Enter" signs on the doors. Charlie Taylor, the chief inspector, was shocked when he visited the centre. He said it smelled like cannabis everywhere and detainees were openly smoking joints. He had never seen anything like it in any immigration detention centre or prison before. Taylor was extremely concerned about the conditions at Harmondsworth. He said the centre was in chaos and detainees were at risk of harm. He questioned why so many people were being held at the centre if they weren't going to be deported quickly. 6% of detainees were actually released from the centre back into the community, with only a third of that percentage being deported. The watchdog's report was clearly disappointed with the wasteful spending of taxpayer money on detaining people who would eventually be released. Kolbasia Hauso, a refugee who survived torture in Africa and now works for the charity Freedom from Torture, has personal experience with Harmondsworth Immigration Removal Centre. He was held there when he first arrived in the UK in 2005. He understands the harmful effects of detention and is pleading with the new Labour government to create a fair asylum system that respects human rights and dignity. The report also included some issues Mitty is facing, waiting staff shortages, which were made worse by the Home Office's mishandling of the contract renewal process.
That's the thing with the migration issue. All of our countries in the developed world are struggling with this. I think broadly speaking, a lot of our politicians treat us like we are incredibly febrile, easily riled up, dangerous mobs.
Douglas thinks that we shouldn't let the Palestinians stay in London.
My own view is that it shouldn't, and it shouldn't because it's not because it should be banned, but because it's a grotesque insult to the British people. It's a deliberately provocative day to choose for such a march. It's a deliberately provocative march.
The Telegraph also showed that around half of the organisers of the march are linked with bad organisations.
As the Telegraph showed just yesterday, around half of the organisers of the march are themselves linked with which isn't at all surprising. We have commanders, after all, who live in London very safely, often on welfare.
Douglas states that it's intolerable provocation to the British public and government.
So, yes, I think it's an intolerable march. It's an intolerable provocation to the British public and the British government and the British police, by the way, who Saturday after Saturday have been made to put up with unbelievable taunting and abuse from the marchers.
And the crowds are pushing the police further and more provocative.
It's very clear by now, Piers, that what is happening is that every week the crowds are pushing and seeing if they can push the police further and further, harder and harder, and be more and more provocative. And they're managing to do that.
Douglas think that large numbers of the British public are just not going to put up with this.
But this is culminating this weekend, and here's the thing. I don't think, and I certainly read and hear, that large numbers of the British public are just not going to put up with this. Well, we'll try to single those two things out for a second. First of all, I don't regard Nicholas Soames as a sort of hereditary inheritor of the mantle of Churchill just because he happens to be his grandson.
He believes the UK is in a deep, unsolvable crisis.
Besides what you quoted from Christopher earlier, he would never have said that right extended to supporting terror groups. I mean, we're in a total quandary in the UK, as you know, and it's a despicable quandary to be in. We host leaders. We have a former deputy prime minister of Iran living in Harrow. We've been at the centre of allowing these people to be in our country and indeed to plot terror from our country for years. So it's always a bit rich to hear the British, I think, lecturing others about being an unsound part of the international security community. As for the actual marches, look, I'm afraid that the rules on this are very, very clear. You are not allowed to glorify terror or call for terror on the streets of Britain. And that existed before the 2006 Act banned glorification, and it certainly exists now. I'll tell you what's unique about the population of Gaza. It's the only population in the world where people routinely claim are committing genocide, but which has a population boom all of the time. I mean, that strikes me as being quite an interesting thing about the Gaza. But as for the moral community, I want to make a very, very important point, if I can say so, on this, which is, people quite often abuse history, and they say things all the time. I mean, about the only thing anyone from history knows is about. Here's something I can tell you with absolute certainty, Piers, having not just seen some of the results of what did on the ground here in a few weeks ago, but having watched the videos of the unedited footage, which I was one of the journalists who was sadly allowed to see the other day, I can tell you one thing: the comparison between and the is insufficient. And sorry, there's an incoming. It's fine. Sorry, it was a rocket coming. Looked like it was just going to land on us here.
In Sweden, those who break immigration rules face strict penalties.
As you say, this is in 2015, the Swedes opened their borders. They said it's incredibly important to be open-hearted and generous to the world and so on. But what they did was, as we just heard in the previous segment, they did what a lot of governments have been doing. You effectively punish people who come to our countries legally. You punish them and you incentivize people who break the rules and come illegally. And that's happening everywhere from Sweden to America to Britain and Australia. It's an astonishing mistake. But yes, I mean, as Rita says, you have this crazy situation. Like Sweden, do you remember the old days? We all used to talk about Sweden, always a Scandinavian option for everything. Anything in life could be improved by referring to Scandinavia. People would say, oh, well, the Swedish this, the Danish that, whether it was a hot drink or a way to feel good or a policy. It was always about Scandinavia. And then, as you say, Rita, you get this situation where you have now Sweden, the second largest number of any country not officially only after Mexico. Only after Mexico. And if I'd have said to you 10 years ago, what do you think about when you think about Sweden? Like me, you'd have probably said, well, I don't know, hot drinks, overpriced food, but nice people, or rather cold. You wouldn't have said, the traditional Swedish. Never forget the intrinsic importance to our culture of grenades. And but that's the case because they just didn't care about who they let in. And it meant that they were letting in military-aged males who very often lied about their age And, none of this, there are legitimate asylum seekers in the world. Those people are completely stripped of their capabilities and their rights. When you allow, as I've seen this in Sweden myself, big bearded guys in their 20s who say, oh, I'm a child migrant, allowed into a school and so on, and they just lose control of everything. But, that's the thing with the migration issue. All of our countries in the developed world are struggling with this.
Millions worldwide are desperate to migrate to safer nations.
There are millions upon millions of people in the world who want to come to relatively safe, liberal, democratic countries like this one, like Britain, like America, like European countries. And the question is, are we able to step up to that challenge and actually bring in people at a reasonable rate, or is that too difficult for our politicians? Well, that's right. I mean, we know, James, don't we? We know the values of this. We know the reason why people come to our countries. There is no movement the other way. I mean, I always say, when the boats were coming to Australia with illegals from other parts of this region, it wasn't like they met boats the other way of Aussies desperately trying to flee the oppressive, conservative or otherwise government in Australia. The movement is always one way. I mean, you don't even get people moving from Britain to France on the boats. It's always France to Britain. People want to move up through Europe. When people cross the Rio Grande, when these Mexican cartels and others take very, very beleaguered people who've given their life savings to horrible, horrible gangs, you don't find a bunch of Texans saying they want to flee to the freedom of Ecuador. Now, my point on that is, therefore, we should have the courage to say, look, at the very least, we must be doing something right. There must be something we're doing right.
Despite years of awareness, immigration and integration remain unresolved issues.
It's a very strange thing, and as you said it before, we've got this situation where you can talk about it in economic terms, you can talk about it in housing terms, but the larger cultural terms are still a third rail. And I'm astonished that after all of these years, we've known the issues of immigration and integration for many years. I'm amazed that we're still in all of our countries at this very, very toddler stage of the debate. It shouldn't be that hard to say, look, if you want to come to Australia, you want to become part of Australia, you've got something to give to this country, and you will give to this country, and you want to be part of it, fantastic. Join the queue and let's see what we can do. But if it's the case that you want to come here and you don't really like the place, or you want to change the place, or you want to change the place back to the sort of place where the place you left from, and maybe some of the reasons why you left, then maybe that's not going to be a workable deal. Yes, I mean, effectively a mob outside of Parliament affected the workings of Parliament in Westminster. But, the really interesting thing on that is the politicians, even after that happened, couldn't identify who had been doing the threatening. They couldn't identify it. They talk about it, all of our politicians do that, they talk about these amorphous things like, we must stand against hate. Okay, and then what? And who? Get specific. Who were the group outside Parliament? Who was it projecting slogans onto Big Ben and our representatives are meant to be voting? Who is it that our representatives feel a threat from? And this can go wrong really fast if you don't identify it. I mean, our politicians should be frank. Are they feeling terrible threats and changes to their voting processes because of people from Wales? Or is it people who is it the people who live and work in Chinatown? Is that a place that members of Parliament shouldn't go? Let's be specific about it. And they cannot be, and even in Britain, and Rita and I have spoken about this before, even in Britain, when another of our MPs was a couple of years ago, even then, his colleagues couldn't identify the ideology that had their colleague. They talked about him as if he of natural causes. And I think they do a great dishonour, not just to their colleague and to themselves, but to the public when they can't be open and honest about that. I think broadly speaking, a lot of our politicians treat us like we are incredibly febrile, easily riled up, dangerous mobs. Decent sort of person. Same thing with the British public. Same thing with the American public. We're not deplorables. We're not easily riled, violent gangs.
So, history of Christianity, more bloody or less bloody if Jesus was more like Muhammad?
In the 2000s, I started to think, if somebody came along and declared prophethood at the moment, they could do quite well.
Douglas claims that just because you've lost the religion doesn't mean you've lost the religious instinct. If you take Christianity out, and other things will be put in.
I wonder if it's the same with societies. I think that it's a thing like post-religious peoples. Just because you've lost the religion doesn't mean you've lost the religious instinct.
Right.
You're still looking for it.
It seems like that's an inherent part of being a person.
I agree, and I don't say it's bad. It's just it is part of what we are, and it seems to me very clear that, for instance, you take Christianity out and other things will be put in, and they don't even need to be identifiable religions.
Douglas believes that there's this sort of form of watered-down spillover of Christianity.
I mean, our own age has decided in much of the West that there's this sort of form of watered-down spillover of Christianity which will become the sort of religion, which is the kind of diversity, inclusion, equity world where you constantly struggle for greater justice, all of which is a sort of very watered-down version of a little bit of Christianity.
Joe Rogan believes that there's a clear genesis in the woke world.
There's a clear genesis of that, too, in the woke world. There was a group at a certain point in time. Do you remember when the atheist movement had hit this Atheist Plus movement? Do you remember Atheism Plus?
What was that?
Joe Rogan talks about the rise of the Atheist Plus movement. This movement promotes being anti-discrimination and anti-racist as new forms of belief.
It was weird, and it was a bunch of these weird virtue-signaling male feminist types that were adding, with atheism, adding a group of core values.
Oh, wow.
About, being anti-racist.
Their own 10 commandments.
Yes. And so they called it Atheism Plus. And I remember watching this guy give this speech, this boring speech, on this sort of establishing this idea that because you don't have a religion, so we're going to be atheists, but with plus, we can establish sort of a moral framework.
Well, it's totally understandable and a disaster, of course.
Even if the ideas are good, it's like you're putting it in an ideology. You're creating a dogma. You're creating
all those new atheists who sort of started off in the 2000s, like our friend Sam Harris and others. They, in my experience, they all got a little bit nervous about what was on their shoulders. Christopher Hitchens certainly did. He started, I think, latterly in his life to get a little bit nervous about what was happening. I remember once asking him what about it. He said people were starting to ask him to officiate at their weddings.
Oh,
yeah, and that was like he didn't say anything of what he said was wrong. He still obviously believed everything he believed, but like that's a slightly troubling place to be in, because you start to sense people are wanting you to replace the vicar or the priest, and that's like not the point. Then you're in Life of Brian territory, aren't you? It's like, I want, you should all think for yourselves. Yes, we all think for ourselves. It was always a problem of atheism, was like it was an invitation to not do one thing.
Yeah.
But nothing follows from it as to how you should live your life. It's the start of something. It's not by any means the beginning of a policy.
Do you think that's just an inherent thing about being a tribal primate, that we have this desire to have someone wiser, a leader, and then even better if you can have like a godlike figure who gives you a set of rules that you have to follow, or there are horrendous consequences, and it keeps everyone in line?
Yeah, absolutely.
Douglas claims there are still people who see themselves as prophets.
In the 2000s, I started to think, if somebody came along and declared prophethood at the moment, they could do quite well. I mean, think of those hucksters on US television who still still take money from people, saying that they can only build the church and have their helicopter if you send in your dollars, you know? Those people still exist. There's a guy who's still selling his like silver water that he blesses from the River Jordan or something. It comes out some hose in his garden in Texas, you know. Yeah. And there are people who've been busted repeatedly, and they're still selling their wares. I always thought, if somebody actually made the prophet claim in our era, I think people would be surprised how many people would go along with it. It's the late George Steiner described. A phrase I love, nostalgia for the absolute. I love that phrase, a nostalgia for the absolute. I think a lot of people have it. I have it. We all have it to some extent. And the question is whether you can avoid it taking you to places that would demoralize you and lead you to a bad place.
He questions the assertion that our basic shared ethics are self-evident.
It's not a secret, that having been said, I was born and brought up a Christian, as a believing Christian, from I think most of my life, including through my adult life. And I'm now in, I suppose, a self-confessedly conflicted, complex situation of being, among other things, an uncomfortable agnostic who recognizes the values and the virtues that the Christian faith has brought. I think I sort of laid out how I think our civilization, our culture has got to the stage that it is at the moment and its current uncomfortable relationship with faith. I tried to lay that out in Strange of Europe. I still believe what I wrote there was accurate as a diagnosis of the era. But it's a very uncomfortable, as I say, position that someone like me is in, because I say, there has been a period of rejection of faith, particularly from what in our lifetimes has been known as the New Atheist movement, which made claims that were self-confessedly wrong. That, for instance, actually I think as a late friend of both Tom Wright's and mine, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs once said, that the claim that, for instance, morality was obvious was obviously wrong. The claim that basic ethics that we might share are self-evident is self-evidently not the case. One doesn't have to be an ethicist to know that. You just need to travel. You just need to read, look and listen, and to know that's the case. So there has, in my view, I think we spoke about this before, Justin, that there has, in my view, been an interesting movement in recent years, which I think Tom Holland, who you mentioned earlier, is certainly an example of people saying, actually, if we go back and look at this, what we have and what we like does have roots in this, in the Christian story. Now, the follow-on question from there, I suppose, is, well, what do we do about it? And I think that a great failing of our time has been the tendency to talk past each other on this. The religious tend to say, well, it's easy, you just have to believe. If you recognize these virtues and values, then believe. And doesn't take into account the fact that very many people today, it is harder than that, for all sorts of reasons we could go into. But I would just make one other observation, which is that even outside of faith, I have an added discomfort, which is the discomfort of a non-believer who is disappointed by the behavior of a believing church. Now, many people think that's paradoxical, but it isn't at all.
Based on his experience, Douglas observes many churches evolving into something else.
Not only was brought up in, but afterwards sought the church as it has been in England, and its jewels and gems of the King James Bible, the Book of Common Prayer, and much more. And it's been my experience, as it has been for many other people brought up in recent decades and last century and more, that one has observed the church giving up its jewels and becoming something else. And actually, that irritation I feel from the outside, albeit from the outside at the moment, that irritation I feel about the church hasn't gone away even whilst being outside it. A fear, it comes back to that article that provoked Tom Wright's excellent letter. My fear is constantly the church is not doing what so many of us on the outside would like it to do. which is to be preaching its gospel, to be asserting its truths and its claims. And so when one sees it falling into all of the latest tropes, one just thinks, well, that's another thing gone. It's just like absolutely everything else in the era. Everything in this boring, monotone, ill thought out and shallow dialectic. And so as I say, I'm a disappointed non-adherent. You can't wish things you know and wish them unknown, or wish them unlearned. And this is something I think is very important in all dialogue between believers and non-believers. I just wanted to say, I wouldn't like it to be anyone to take away from this that I simply think that the church has a PR problem. It isn't just that I think that the presentation is wrong, or that there's a mistake in, for instance, falling into the religion of anti-racism or anything else. It's that I do believe that doing that means that the church fails to tell its own story. We had an article in the Spectator, I think last week, from my friend.
He believes it's not just a PR misunderstanding, but a missed opportunity within the church.
He made a very powerful point about the figures in the church, for instance, who were profoundly anti, and not just Wilberforce, but Charlemagne and others who saints in the 7th century, Christian saints in the 7th century, who were martyred and objected to the in their own time. There is, what I'm trying to say is that it's not just there is a PR misunderstanding, it seems to me, within the church, and it's missing a trick. It is that this is not a fair summary of the Christian story. It isn't a fair summary of the story of the church. And what it is the adoption of a facile and profoundly hostile analysis of the church, which sees the church, for instance, as being a white enterprise. But it clearly isn't. Like Tom Wright has seen congregations across the world. I've been at services throughout the Middle East, across Africa. Beleaguered communities sometimes show absolutely extraordinary and inspiring levels of faith. And I don't recognize the negative interpretation of the church, which I see from some people trying to force a different ethic on the church today. But as I say, it's not just in the history of the church, but in the story that the church has to tell about itself today, that I think that there is an error being made. Because, for instance, to go back to something which, as Tom Wright knows, I wrote about in The Madness of Crowds, if you look at the great error of the ideology which is trying to embed today, it is that it has spent no time bothering itself over the question of forgiveness. Now, it's not just that I think that the church is missing a PR trick in not addressing this. I think that the church does everybody in society the most enormous disservice if it doesn't say, this is what our faith is built upon. We have been thinking about this and trying to practice it, at least, for millennia. So at least give us your ear for a moment.
Douglas shares his perspective on Christians and his beliefs.
Well, it means I'm not a believer in God, or at least I find it very hard to believe in God. I'd say maybe agnostic is better. But obviously I'm a Christian because I was born in a Christian civilization, a Christian country, brought up a Christian. So, I mean, there are people who lose their faith or don't have faith and are Jewish or Muslim, but that's not the same thing as a Christian atheist. I just think it's absurd not to concede the fact that much of what we have in America, like Britain, Canada, is derived from Christian ethics, right? Christian ideas. And why deny that? I mean, you might not believe it, but you shouldn't deny it because it's obvious. I mean, what are human rights but a kind of derivation of a form of spilt Christianity? There's no reason to have human rights. They're not self-evident.
No.
So I think that, you should just concede these things where they're true, and even if they're against your interests, and obviously for atheists it's against their interests very often, but nevertheless. And I also say that it's important to concede this because you should try to work out, I think, whether you want to engage in sawing off a branch of a tree that you're sitting on.
speculates how Christianity's history might have been different if Jesus were more like Muhammad.
What is one of the greatest moments in Christian scripture, but the moment when Jesus has brought to him the woman who was caught in adultery? And what does Jesus say when the crowd wanted to stone her for her sins? He says, "He who is without sin cast the first stone." And the crowd go away. Now, in the Islamic tradition, a very, very similar thing happens when a woman is brought to Muhammad and he has her stoned. So, history of Christianity, more bloody or less bloody if Jesus was more like Muhammad?
Douglas underscores the belief that all men are equal because they are created equal by God.
I think everyone would say likely to be more bloody. There are enlightened traditions within certain Muslim traditions, certain ones. They tend, by the way, to be highly prejudiced against by other Muslims. I'm thinking of things like the Ahmadiyya community, certain branches of Sufi Islam, which have very admirable attitudes towards enlightenment and a sort of syncretic belief of their own. But these are minority sects within Islam and are largely hated by other Muslims. Islam is about subjugation to Allah. And that's why, one of the reasons why the Muslim world is as it is. The Christian world is as it is because of the legacy of Christianity. I mean, it's from Christianity that we get the idea of rights. Why do I say that? Because even the framers of the European Constitution pretty much knew this. Certainly the framers of the UN Declaration on Human Rights knew this. Certainly the founding fathers of the United States knew this. That the reason why all men are regarded as equal is because all of mankind is created equal by God. And that people may be different in their lives, and we're all different in our lives, and you may be a car mechanic or a king, but that we're all the same. We're all the same in the eyes of God, in the eyes of the Creator. Nobody to that extent has the ability to be, is by nature better or worse than anyone else. It's the adventure of their lives to try to be better. But all of these ideas, like the dignity of the individual, these come from the Judeo-Christian tradition. And without them, we would be, like China, or like the Islamic world, or like anywhere else. If we had a different tradition in our past, we would be in a different place now. But this was our tradition. This is our tradition. And anyone who thinks that what I've just described is as water is to fish is making a vast category error. So this idea that Western civilization is like a cut flower and you can look at it and enjoy it, but it's going to die. So how do we make sure that it isn't a cut flower? And the answer to that is, of course, we find the seeds that planted the flowers and we reseed the land. We replant the flowers, the trees and the bushes of our culture and of our civilization. And that's what we should do. That will be part of the task ahead. And that doesn't mean the dogmatic re-Christianization, although some people might like to go that route, but it does mean a recognition of the wellsprings. And, without that, nothing good can come. Without that, we will simply be a flower that withers.
He discusses the potential overlap between the realms of science and religion.
It is a sort of a necessary thing to begin with, which is the issue of the magisteria. We are talking about them separately, but of course the interrelation of them. Whether or not the realms of science and religion are overlapping magisteria or not. And of course some people would claim that they're absolutely unrelated. We're getting towards, I think, in this discussion, the realization that of course they're overlapping to some degree. We don't know exactly how much. Jonathan probably thinks very significantly. I suspect Jordan thinks to some extent, and I would say to some extent as well. But let me throw out then two issues that I would put as a challenge both for the religious and the non-religious in the discussion that we're heading towards.
The first is a challenge for the non-religious, and that's to do with something that Jordan's already talked about, which is the area of ethics and shared values and much more. A great challenge for the non-believers in our age is that issue of where the values come from. And as Jordan's already suggested, for instance, the Enlightenment, the idea of rationalism, soul rationalism, which not all Enlightenment thinkers were dealing with, but many were. The idea of rationalism being the sole way in which to discern ethics seems to me not to have been embedded very wide or very deep, and may suggest that it's just not possible as a project. So, to quote my late friend Rabbi Jonathan Sachs on this, the idea that ethics are self-evident is self-evidently wrong.
The challenge for believers, he says, is in treating myths or stories as if they hold ultimate truth.
So let me throw that out first as a challenge for the non-believer. Then the challenge for the believer comes down to this thing that Jordan's also already dealt in, which is the issue of, let's say, myth or story. Because we might agree, for instance, that we need a story to agree upon, or a myth to agree upon, or a set of ideas to rely upon and to ground ourselves in. And that doesn't necessarily, of course, by any means lead to the fact that those things are also true. We get into the realm of what Schopenhauer in the Dialogue on Religion, which always made a huge impression on me, deals in, where he says, of course, what he describes as the tragedy of the clergy. That the tragedy of the clergy is that they know the necessity of the thing, they know the truthfulness of the story, in a certain sense of truthfulness, but could never admit, or their job would be over, that that's what it is.
They must navigate their faith as if these stories are not just allegorical, but have real truth claims.
In other words, they have to continue to deal in it as if this is not simply story or unifying myth or anything like that, but is something which has a truth claim behind it. And then let me just say one other thing on that, which is this. The issue of unifying ethic, because it must be what we're sort of somehow also, among other things, as well as trying to define what the true is and what the real is, must be one of the things that we must sort of try to grapple towards. The issue on this seems to me to be, is the Christian ethic, the Christian tradition, to think of it in Hegelian terms, is it an exhausted force or an unexhausted force? This for our age seems to me to be one of the absolutely crucial issues to address. Is it exhausted or unexhausted? I mean, the issue with the Bible, the issue with Christianity, the issue with faith is that it's obviously different. It must be in a different realm. It's clearly in a different realm because it claims different things for itself. Dostoevsky doesn't demand that we believe that Raskolnikov lived. The Bible, if you're going to be a believer, you have to be able to say, in the words of the Creed, that you believe in the virgin birth, that you believe, most importantly, in the resurrection. And as you well know, Jordan, many of us can walk 99% of the way there in terms of belief in the truth of the story. Or as Betjeman puts it, but is it true, is it true? And then stumble on the last thing.
Douglas acknowledges the particular conundrum raised by the resurrection and its implications for reality.
I don't disagree with that. What Jonathan says about the resurrection and reality, of course, raises a particular conundrum, which is that if you're going to use religion as an explanation of reality, you're also describing the event that subverts reality completely. That the resurrection is the thing that is the least possible thing to do given the world as we understand it. What I'm trying to get to is a sort of, not to diminish it, but having your cake and eating it thing, which is religion explaining reality, reality explained by religion, and also this thing happens that has never been able to happen and that if you can make that leap, then you've got the faith in religion. I'm not saying that this isn't possible to do. You obviously do it yourself, but it's two things that seem to be in some very, very deep way contradictory. And maybe the contradiction is the point.